I'd like to welcome you to the Empower You America podcast tonight. Tonight's discussion, this will be the second discussion in a two-part series with Mike Wilson. So Mike spoke last week about a personal use of AI, and this week he'll be talking about enterprise AI. So using enterprise systems that have AI integrated into them. He'll talk about how they work, and then from an executive standpoint, how to think about them strategically. So now I'd like to formally introduce Mike Wilson. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Interlink Cloud Advisors, which is a Microsoft-centered technology consulting firm. And Interlink actually helps organizations modernize their infrastructure. They strengthen their cybersecurity, and they help them realize or optimize business value from emerging technologies. They also translate advances in AI into practical strategies for productivity and innovation and organizational transformation. So Mike, he's really a trusted industry voice. He's regularly quoted in technology and business publications that cover AI, cybersecurity, cloud computing, and digital transformation. So Mike, welcome back. We appreciate you coming back for part two.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Super excited to be with the Empower You team and all of our friends that are watching at home to do this again. So
great. So tonight's format will be similar to last week's. Mike will give a presentation, and then we'll take questions. If you have any questions, you see that we're using a different platform this week, so you can submit the questions through the comments tab on the right side, and we will see those questions, and we will. I'm sorry, I just saw a note here. It says no sound. I assume we're okay with sound. Someone said a few minutes ago we had no sound. So we'll take the questions at the end of Mike's presentation. So feel free throughout the talk to submit your questions whenever you have them. We'll get to them at the end of the talk. So that's it for me. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and I'll be back a bit later.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
Go through and share my screen. Jerry, do you want to bring that on camera or bring that on? Yeah, Jerry, I'm still seeing the background for Empower You. I'm not seeing my presentation showing on the screen. There we go. Thank you. So just a few growing pains. We're learning how to go through and use the new platform. So appreciate everyone's patience with us. But Mike, I appreciate the kind introduction. As everyone said, I'm Mike Wilson. I'm Chief Technology Officer with Interlink Cloud Advisors. I'm also, you may know me from some of my involvement in the political time, founding the Cincinnati Tea Party as well. Don't do as much of that, spend a lot more time talking to customers about AI and these days, and really how to go through and kind of drive real business value from their investment. So we're going to start. It's going to be a relatively similar format to what we did if you had a chance to go through and join us on Thursday. We're going to hit some of the modern AI concepts just to make sure. So there might be a little bit of repeat if you're on there, but I promise it gets very different very quickly as we go through the presentation. We're going to talk about how to go through and choose an AI platform. Again, this time from a business perspective, not a personal standpoint. So there's a lot more involved in thinking through that. What it takes to go through and build an AI-powered organization. How we actually go through and drive business outcomes, because that's where the return on investment comes from these investments. And then some real world examples where we've helped customers just to kind of get the creative juices flowing in terms of how to move forward. So again, I'll go through and start one more time by talking through technological disruption and really how important this is to really our overall economy and standard of living. And so the things that these have in common, if we look at things like airplanes, which were developed by the Wright brothers in 1903, you really didn't see commercial air travel start to become viable and really impact the company until post-World War II. Similarly, automobiles, they rolled off the first assembly line there from Henry Ford in 1908, but we really didn't go through and build an interstate highway system that connected America until the 1960s. We had the first computer in 1939, but it was the IBM PC in the 1980s that really started to go through and democratize that, where we started seeing those pop up for business usage and things like that. The internet. So we first networked computers in 1969. But think about when you got your first email address. It was probably sometime in the mid to late 90s, and it wasn't really until the mid 2000s and beyond where we started to see e-commerce go through and kind of transition and disrupt traditional retail. Now, AI assistants, 1996. Clippy's on there as a joke. That was an example, a pretty failed Microsoft experiment as part of Office 1997. But the true difference here, when we start thinking about AI, here in 2026, is that ChatGPT 3 was essentially launched in 2023. And unlike all of the previous technologies, which took significant time to go through and diffuse through the economy, ChatGPT was the fastest application, to go through and hit 100 million users, and it did so in 2 months from when it's launched. Right, so we're already seeing significant change being driven by AI, and if you're not on the path to go through and take advantage of AI for your business, you are already falling behind. So what does it mean? All of these things drive enormous growth in GDP. So as we go through and see these technology changes going through and diffuse to the economy, we see acceleration in GDP growth, which again turns into standard living for everybody. Now, if you're one of the people who's looking at AI and saying, hey, it's going to go through and it's going to take all the jobs, I don't think that's going to be the case at all. I think AI is going to lead to a lot of prosperity because we're going to automate a lot of things that were previously very manual. But at the same time, if you go through and you think about it, we have done significant automation with the assembly line, the Industrial Revolution. We've added 7.5 billion people over the time frame of this graph from the year 1000 on, and we still haven't run out of jobs. And AI isn't going to change that. Even where we go through and apply AI to go through and solve business problems, we're still going to go through and see the importance of human judgment in directing the tasks that AI should go work on. All right, so level setting again. 2 kinds of AI, right? Traditional AI and generative AI. Traditional AI has actually been around for quite a while. Right. And so in the industry, we talk about things like machine learning algorithms, right, where I can go through and point machine learning at a data set that can then go through and do prediction or classification based on the data that it's looking at. This is a technology that's been around for years. A lot of organizations are using it to go through and analyze data sets. It could be things like telemetry that comes off a manufacturing line, where we can start to use predictive analytics to determine when and where we should be doing maintenance on our machines. To go through and keep our assembly lines up and running more frequently. Things like image and text recognition, optical character recognition, where we can scan a document in and have it go through and recognize that and convert that to editable text in like Microsoft Word. Voice recordings and transcriptions. Doctors are used to using Dragon transcription software for years to go through and enter their notes and enter charts and data and things like that. So AI has been around for a while. But what's different now when we start talking about modern AI, generative AI, large language models such as ChatGPT, the difference here is that the traditional AI, we're working with what I call structured or semi-structured data, right? For machine learning algorithms, I'm pointing it at a database, I'm pointing it at tables of data that have a very consistent format. Even things like optical character recognition, I'm looking for specific things like, again, I'm looking for words, I'm looking for optical characters that we can go through and extract from that. The difference though with generative AI is that we work with unstructured content. It goes through, it creates, and it transforms. It can write something for us. It can rewrite it. It can summarize and explain when we share content. It can create new content. And the difference is that we're interacting it with in plain language. Traditional AI was typically done or used by, again, developers who are developing programs. They're using it as part of essentially building blocks as part of broader business processes or algorithms that they're working with. Generative AI, we can interact with in plain language, which is a huge advantage when we start talking about broader AI adoption. We also want to go through and distinguish between AI assistants and AI agents, right? And so when we think about an AI assistant, this is me going to ChatGPT, this is me going to Claude, this is me going to Copilot. Okay, and I'm going to go through and say, I'm going to ask it to go through and help me do something. I'm going to ask it to research a topic for me. I'm going to ask it to create new content. I'm going to ask it to analyze data. I'm going to ask it to summarize data. It's there waiting for me to go through and give it something to do, and I'm typically working with it on a transactional basis. I go through, I make an ask, it gives me a response. Now I can continue that conversation, and that's one of the techniques we talked about on Thursday. We don't want to go through and start a new chat every single time, right? But in the end, it's sitting there waiting for me to go through and give it a task for it to go through and complete. But when we start thinking about AI agents, and this is where we start talking about where business transformation starts to occur, is that agents can go through and complete multi-step tasks. That means that they're going to receive input, and that's, again, could be input from a human. It could be an email that comes in that we want to go through and reason across. It could be, a trigger that we go through and run on a scheduled basis. They go through and they reason about what they're trying to accomplish. And so in this case, the agent's going through and essentially thinking about what steps to go through and take. And then from there, it has actions they can take. These are essentially in the industry called skills. Okay, and this could be, I want to go through and add an accounts receivable record into my payment system. It could be, I want to go through and send an email summarizing a topic that came in. I mean, essentially, we go through and kind of pair up what it is we're trying to accomplish with the actions that an agent can go through and take. All right, so as we think about kind of the right set of tools here for the business, right? This is very different than when we were thinking about personal AI usage, which we talked about on Thursday. So in this scenario here, obviously we want to look at tool capabilities. And so the first version of this slide that I went through and put together was probably about 2 years ago at this point. And at the time there were big differences in model performance across vendors, right? So the quality of the reasoning, the accuracy, the frequency of hallucinations, things like that. But what we're seeing more and more over time is that model performance at the high-end level is converging on capabilities. They're all really, really good right now. And so spending a lot of time trying to figure out, is ChatGPT the best model? Is Claude the best model? Is XAI and Grok the best model? Is Microsoft? I mean, it really doesn't matter at this point. They're all really, really good, and they're all fit for purpose in a lot of cases. So where the differentiation we're really starting to see that's more important is when we start thinking about data and system access. How easy is it to go through and connect to the data that's important to my business? How does it go through and align with platforms our teams are already using? And now if I'm in specific industries, we also want to look at industry and role fit. And an example of this that we see pretty frequently is that there's a lot of tools that are written specifically for the legal industry. I think we've all seen examples online of where lawyers have gone through and written briefs, submitted that to a judge, and found that there were cases that were hallucinated entirely. You don't want to be that person. That's the kind of thing that gets you either sanctioned by a judge, held in contempt, or disbarred. And so again, we've seen tools that have cropped up in the legal industry that are very specific to that industry to go through and do legal, essentially legal research. Right. So again, we are going to have some scenarios where industry and role fit matters quite a bit versus kind of looking at some of the general purpose AI tools that we're going to talk about today. The second consideration that's big is going to be kind of the security and governance ecosystem. Right. So we're going to be looking at things like, okay, how is my data protected? Right? Are they taking any of my data and using it to go through and make their models better? Are they even watching how we use the tools and learning from that in order to go through and start to take away some of my intellectual property? How much control do I have and visibility over how the people on my team are using the tools? Are we able to retain that data? Are we capable of doing e-discovery across that data? All of those things are important considerations when we start talking about business AI usage. I was actually editing a contract today where, a customer wanted me to go through and warrant. Now, ironically, we were getting ready to go through and do an AI adoption project for them, but they wanted me to go through and guarantee that any AI that we used, that the data was obtained legally, and that essentially there's no issues to it, and there's nothing that is being used to go through and kind of train the models. And what's interesting there, not a single enterprise AI platform that's in the industry right now can go through and make that warrant. Most of the models have been trained by pulling data off of the open public internet. And so again, there's it's just kind of an interesting scenario here where people are trying to go through, they're worried about AI risk. They're starting to write that stuff into contracts that they use with vendors, which again, I think is entirely fair kind of in this scenario. But at the same time, so that means that as we go through and pick enterprise tools, we've got to be able to go through and understand the scenarios that we're working with and making sure that we're capable of delivering on whatever promises we're making as part of those contracts. Responsible AI is another consideration here. And so this is looking at things for is the vendors that we're working with from a model standpoint, are they putting in safeguards around bias? Are they transparent in their approach, right? Do we have human oversight in the loop in terms of how we go through and use these tools? And a good example for this is you can go through and use AI to go through and help identify and match resumes to skills, but I can't go through and have AI qualify or disqualify candidates based on just an AI evaluation. Okay, and so I know it sounds a little bit subtle in terms of the distinction there. Okay, but essentially from a responsible AI standpoint, we don't want to make sure that the use of AI introduces bias into the process. We still want humans to go through, okay, and ultimately make that decision, which is really important. And then compliance matters quite a bit. Again, as we're starting to go through and have contractual obligations around this, so making sure that we've got certifications from the vendor, right, and audit trails that can go through and prove that we've met our obligations from a compliance standpoint. And then the last piece here is buy versus extend versus build. And so what does that mean? All right, so the question is, do I want to go through and use a general purpose tool? Do I want to go through and take a general purpose tool and kind of extend it for my particular use cases? Or do I want to go through and build something entirely from scratch? All of those are very viable options. So we want to think about what is our time to value, right? So how quickly do we go through and deliver measurable results for our business? What's the total cost of ownership? How much is it going to cost me in terms of licensing? Am I paying per user per month? Am I going to be paying for the tokens and the reasoning that occurs on a as consumed basis? What is the ongoing maintenance going to look like? And then vendor viability. What is the company stability? What is their long-term roadmap? What is their long-term support? We're seeing a lot of AI startups come into kind of the modern world right now. And I'll tell you, I'll bet probably 80% of them aren't going to go through and survive. And so making sure that you kind of pick the right horse, make an investment that you can count on being there over time, I think is incredibly important from an overall decision-making standpoint. So on Thursday, we talked a little bit about major personal AI tools, but we're here to talk more about business. And so we're going to pull a couple of them off of that list as Perplexity and Grok are a little bit more personal focused at this point. And really kind of what we're seeing here is that if you go through and you look at what are your major business tools, okay, that are very open in terms of their ability to integrate with other systems, that are kind of targeting business enterprise usage and are not really niche for any particular industry, it's really four major players right now. So ChatGPT from OpenAI, Microsoft with their implementation of models from ChatGPT and Claude inside of Microsoft 365, that's Copilot. Gemini, which is built into Google's tools, and then Claude kind of building their own ecosystem and set of models as well. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the vendors and come back to them here in a minute. But I also think it's important to go through and talk about one more time the model versus the model harness and why this is important. So the model itself is what is providing the intelligence. Okay, this is where when we go through and we give it info, right, it predicts what should come back. And essentially it works off of the training data that was given, and generally the more traded data that was given, the better quality answers that it's giving back to us. But basically it runs a single time. We give it a set of data, it returns data back to us. It doesn't have any memory, doesn't have any tools, it doesn't have any actions that it can go through and take. Right, so the harness becomes incredibly important because this is where the model helps us actually get work done, right? And so whether it's working in like ChatGPT's interface where I have the history of my conversations, okay, that has access to its memory, right? So it understands the things that we've talked about before. It can read files that I can copy and paste in. It can take actions. Maybe I can have it connect to my email and send an email on my behalf. But essentially that model harness is what takes that raw intelligence and then gives it a way to go through and turn that into action. Okay, and that's where ultimately kind of the money is made from a business standpoint. All right, so I think it's important here to kind of talk just a little bit about some of the big players kind of in the industry and how they differentiate. So if you look at kind of OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, each of them are going to be operating only within their particular model ecosystem. Now, each of them have multiple models that are available at different levels of quality, at different levels of cost as part of that. And I'm not going to go super deep because this really isn't a pricing exercise, and I'm not looking to go through and do that. But understand that if you go to OpenAI, Anthropic, or Google, you're kind of locked into their platforms from a model standpoint. Microsoft's a little different in that they're leveraging models from OpenAI, Anthropic, and xAI. So they're kind of building more of an open platform. And then I think what's really important from a business standpoint is the next row down, enterprise data protection. And so what this means is that when my team goes through and uses these platforms, what do I have to pay for in order to make sure that they are not saving my data and using it to train the models? Right? I don't want to be Samsung where I go through and put in product information in the free version of ChatGPT, have that used to train the model, and then I can now ask the model about that particular product and get an answer back. Right? I don't want that to happen with my data. So again, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, they all start at about $20 for their lowest license level that offers that level of data protection. Microsoft includes Copilot Chat in most of their enterprise plans. So if you're already on the platform, you have access to essentially kind of a basic AI tool that's the equivalent of some of OpenAI and Anthropic's, but kind of within that platform. Similarly, you're going to go through and see here that you've got some native access, Microsoft and Google both. If you're already kind of in those platforms, if you're on Microsoft 365 or you're using Google Workspace, the integrations are incredibly helpful. And so you're going to see generally better performance for this. Now, if you're on multiple platforms, maybe I'm using Slack, maybe I'm using Zoom, maybe I'm using kind of a hodgepodge of things, OpenAI and Anthropic might make more sense. All of them, whether it's Microsoft, OpenAI, Anthropic, or Google, can go through and connect to a lot of different platforms to go through and pull information and interact and reason across that as well. The other thing that we want to go through and think about is really around tools for kind of data governance, agent building, and agent governance. And so with that, you kind of have Microsoft's enterprise platform for essentially kind of full data governance, which is built on their Purview platform. So you've got some very deep controls there that work not just across AI, okay, but across essentially all of your enterprise data environment. OpenAI and Anthropic are going to be a little bit more specific in their approach. For them, you've got a set of administrative controls and retention policies and things like that for your usage of those tools, but it's something that's kind of isolated from everything else. It's something that is limited specifically to their ecosystems only. And so typically that means as a business, if I'm going down that path, I may have to go through and implement additional systems to go through and ultimately kind of have that enterprise visibility across everything that we do. And then from an agent standpoint, every one of these I think are viable options to go through and build agents. Again, the place where I would go through and drive differentiation here is from a Microsoft standpoint. They've got tools that are targeted both at end users, just kind of regular people like you and me. Well, maybe not me as CTO, but you know what I mean. Copilot Studio, which is more of a low code, power user type setup, and then support for professional developers as well. Versus you'll see kind of Anthropic being something really focused more specifically on very technical builders as part of that. All right, so after that level set, right, I want to start getting into like talking about practical adoption, right? So I love this comic here. And so I've got a hammer here. I think we may have found a solution to all of our problems, but if you notice there, I don't see a whole lot of nails on that table, right? And so I think a lot of businesses go into the AI journey and they're like, man, AI is going to do everything for me. It's going to be wonderful. And so the answer is it can do a lot of things really, really well, but we want to make sure that we're using AI as the right tool for the job at the right time. And so, I'll go through and take a quote here. This was a study that was released last July from MIT. And so it's from the State of AI in Business. And this really stuck with me because I've seen a lot of customers go down the wrong path here that we've had to go through and kind of help them correct. And so 5% of AI pilots are extracting millions in value, and the vast majority are stuck with no measurable P&L impact, right? So again, let's translate that. Okay, it means here that, again, organizations are making investments in AI. A handful of them are very successful and driving a ton of value. The vast majority of them aren't showing any impact in the P&L. At least that means they're not losing money, but they're not going through and seeing a return on investment, which again, if we're going to go through and we're going to invest in these tools, we want to see it go through and impact our business. And so a lot of what we talk about the rest of the day is going to be how we go through and drive down that way to actually be successful. All right, so I want to walk you through the Microsoft AI platform. So part of that is because, essentially we go through as an Interlink, that's our specialty. I will go through and try to relate some of the concepts to other platforms, but really all of the platforms are going to have a lot of very similar capabilities in terms of how they go through and think about some of this stuff. So I think it's a great way to go through and illustrate how businesses can use this. And again, a lot of organizations are already using Microsoft 365 today. So it becomes, for a lot of places, the fastest way to go through and drive incremental value. All right, so in the Microsoft world, we talk about Copilot as being the user interface for AI. Okay, and so that means that as a user, I want to go through, interact with Copilot. Copilot has access to my data, and everything from an enterprise standpoint is controlled by the Copilot control system. So there's a lot of switches to flip around what data Copilot's going to have access to and who's allowed to use it. Right, but in the end, that becomes kind of a consistent user interface for users across all of the AI tools that they end up using. All right, so I mentioned earlier that Copilot Chat with enterprise data protection is built into the most Microsoft 365 plans. And so what this means is that I have access to an AI tool. And again, a lot of organizations don't even realize that they own this today, which is incredible to me. I see them out there going through and buying like a ChatGPT business plan for $20 a user a month. I'm like, you basically have the same thing inside of Microsoft 365 with your existing license. And so essentially, this is designed for everyday work use, right? And so as we start thinking about what adoption curves look like and how we build AI muscle across the organization, starting with an AI assistant that can go through and answer questions for me, that can do research off the internet, is incredibly valuable. And when we use Copilot Chat as part of the Microsoft 365, you can kind of see here in the upper right corner, we've got this little green shield with a check mark inside of it. I know it's pretty small on the screen, but that's a signal that when I'm working in that data, in that system, okay, that my data is protected. And what's interesting about this is, I personally have gone through and used AI to go through and essentially replace 100% of what I previously would have gone and used for search. And so if you think about going and doing a Google search, okay, when I do that, I'm typically signed into Google, so they know who I am. They have a lot of history on me. Google's whole business model is to go through and understand what is interesting to me so it can serve me ads. Right. And so, from a business standpoint, if I'm going through and searching about, maybe a new product line that I want to go through and launch, okay, Google can extract that information and potentially go through and do something with it. Maybe they want to go through and beat you to the punch kind of in that scenario. But when I use like an AI tool like Copilot Chat, right, I'm able to go through and do internet research without my data being leaked, right, which is incredibly valuable. Right. So again, this is something that we can go through and use as a starting point. There's no additional licensing to be done. There's no setup required. And again, we have access to data on the internet, which is incredibly valuable. And going back to kind of what I said before, Microsoft in this scenario has access to models from Claude and OpenAI in here. This is actually a screenshot from my computer from today. And so it shows the model picker inside of Copilot Chat. And what I think is important here, even whether I'm using Microsoft or I'm using Claude or I'm using ChatGPT, okay, in most cases here, we're going to have multiple models available to us. And again, once upon a time, if we rewind even 6 months ago, a lot of times I would pick a particular model that I thought would do a better job at a given task. These days, kind of the paradigm that we're seeing across business is whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Claude, whether it's OpenAI, let the model picker do the work. Let it go through and based on the task, go through and figure out what model to use. And ultimately, we're seeing really good answers come back from that. And again, we mentioned here kind of the enterprise data protection being pretty important in that one as well. Right. So with all of these tools, right, you're going to see, whether it's Microsoft or otherwise, we're going to see a different set of capabilities at different licensing points. In the Microsoft world, we've got the Copilot Chat, okay, that comes with Microsoft 365 work accounts, that has enterprise data protection, that can go through and access content on the web, that can go through and I can upload files to it, I can generate images, it can help me interpret code. Right, and so it's a great way to go through and get started. But typically, we're going to see organizations go across the maturity curve and start looking to buy essentially enterprise-grade tools. In the Microsoft world, there's two options for that. One of those is going to be Copilot Business, which is limited. It's kind of designed for small business and limited up to 300 users within a given tenant, or Copilot Premium, right, which is essentially put on top of any of the enterprise plans that Microsoft kind of has in that. Right, but in the end, you'll see this with Claude, where they have kind of a business plan, they have a team plan, they have enterprise plans. And again, OpenAI kind of has the same concept here. So it's going to be really important to go through and look at it. But you're typically going to see with the more premium plans, a deeper set of governance, a deeper set of control capabilities that go with that, which is important. Now, from an architecture standpoint, this is, again, I think a great way to go through and kind of understand what we really mean when we talk about a model harness and how it goes through and works with a large language model to produce a business outcome. So this is how Copilot works at M365. So when I'm working inside of Microsoft apps, so Word, Teams, PowerPoint, Outlook, or Excel, or if I'm just in the Copilot chat interface, essentially I go through and I give it a prompt. That's me sending data, okay, into the Copilot control system, kind of at the center of the screen. And again, this doesn't matter. I mean, all of them are going to have kind of the same set of, whether it's Microsoft or otherwise, are going to have the same set of ideas behind this, right? So then we do what we call grounding. Okay, and so grounding in this case means we're going to look for what information in our environment, okay, is relevant to the prompt that I just gave. Maybe I reference a file specifically, but again, in the Microsoft world, okay, it uses what's called Work IQ, okay, which understands me in the context of my work. So it understands who I work with, who I report to, who reports to me. It sees my Teams chats. It understands the documents that I've worked on lately. It understands the emails that I'm interacting with people. It sees my meetings and my meeting recordings as part of that. And so it's looking to go through and say, hey, what information is relevant to this prompt that I can go through and enrich what actually gets sent to the large language model. So as we see kind of step 3, we take that augmented data, we send it to the model, right? We get a response back as part of that. We do one level of kind of grounding again on the other side of it, and then ultimately return whatever answer that we were asking. And so with this, again, kind of in all cases here, ultimately, it's executed with the context of the user who made the request, right? So if I'm ChatGPT and I've set that up to connect to my Google Workspace, it's going to use my user account that I'm signed in to go through and make that request. It's only going to have access to the data that ultimately I have access to as an end user, right? So again, all the models and all of the harnesses are going to have kind of that same setup. And so what's really important here when we start thinking about access to information is that AI doesn't make our data unsafe, right? So if we've done a poor job of curating our data, and so let's say that I have a spreadsheet sitting out there in Google Workspace or on SharePoint that has all of the payroll data. If I've accidentally shared that with somebody that I shouldn't have, AI doesn't change that risk. That risk was already there. What AI changes now is that users have tools that they didn't have access to before, and maybe they go ask a question about payroll, and the AI tool goes through and surfaces an answer. Right. So again, a lot of times businesses are afraid to go through and adopt AI because they understand that the quality of their data isn't good. We'll talk a little bit more later about how we go kind of down that journey of preparing. But fundamentally, right, understand that AI doesn't create the problem. AI just maybe highlights a problem that already existed kind of in that scenario. All right, so as we kind of go down the kind of this journey, right, a lot of times we're starting with, we want to go through and use AI as an assistant. We want to go through and be able to ask it questions, get answers, have it help us create content, help us summarize content and things like that, right? But what we really want to be able to go through and do is, all right, not sure. I've never had that happen before, and now it's happened twice in 4 days, but we lost my headset there briefly. So sorry about that, guys. We turned it back on, and I think we're good. But anyway, as we kind of go down this journey here, right, we have options to go through and use AI as agents, but what we really want to try to get to over time is we want to go through and start seeing AI often as a coworker. And so an example of this is a tool called Cowork. And so this is originally developed by Claude, right, which is Anthropic. It was used kind of with their models. Microsoft has now brought this into Copilot that they have access to it as well. And the difference here from AI Assistant, where I can go through and ask it a question and get an answer, is that Cowork can actually go through and take actions and can do multi-step reasoning. So this means I could go through, and I'll give you a very practical example from my life. But I could go through, have a meeting with a customer. We're talking about a particular need. We're scoping a project for them. I'm asking a lot of questions. And these days, I'm generally recording all of my meetings because I want the AI notes that come through on the other side. Incredibly valuable to have that. It also lets me go through and be more present inside the meetings. Instead of me kind of in OneNote typing things up, I want to go through and make sure that, again, I'm more present, I'm more focused on what we're doing, because in the end, I'll have AI go through and summarize for me on the other side of it. Now, as I go through and kind of think about what are my follow-up tasks, I have a statement of work that I need to go through and write for a customer, and I may want to go through and create a PowerPoint to go through and summarize, okay, that content for them. And so what's very common here for me is I'll go through, I'll do the meeting, I'll have it recorded, Copilot will send me the summary when I'm done, but then I'll go into CoWork where it can go through and create the statement of work for me, create a summary PowerPoint. It can even go through and schedule a follow-up meeting with the customer, right? And so the difference here is that instead of asking and getting an answer, I'm getting actions on the other side, and it can perform multi-step reasoning to get that done. And so again, you've got these tools that are kind of coming up here that are now able to go through and help us take the next step, right? Rather than just being an assistant, we can ask questions. It can actually go through and apply tasks for us on our behalf, which is where we're seeing huge value from an organizational standpoint and massive time saving in that scenario. Right, and so over time here, so we see that in, if you go through and you kind of predict here, I've seen a lot of numbers kind of in this space, but we're talking by 2028 here, we're going to see more agents than people inside of organizations. And so what that means here is that users are going to have to start to figure out how to go through and work with agents to get things done. So as I mentioned before, an agent is something that takes an input, it does reasoning, and then it has skills and actions that it can go through and take. And so we'll see Microsoft, Claude, Google, all of them have created sets of first-party agents kind of within their ecosystem. But we're going to see over time here that organizations are going to go through and build their own agents, right? We're going to want to make sure that we go through and kind of take our business workflows and reimagine those in an AI and agent-driven world. We're also going to go through and see that there's third-party agents that are out there as well. So if you're leveraging an IT service management tool like ServiceNow, or something like Jira Cloud for kind of code management and development, right? We're going to see lots and lots of agents that are available here. And so what's going to happen is we're going to see agents both as coworkers or in some cases even as employees. I will tell you, as I constructed this PowerPoint today, not a lot of the data that was already kind of put together. I was essentially working with Copilot to go through and drive ideation around what I wanted to do. And then I had an agent in PowerPoint that was actually doing the work of making the changes to the slides, okay, based on the suggestions that I'd worked through. And so I'm spending more time over my time managing agents than I am actually creating or doing work on my own at this point, which is a really interesting change. I think I'm probably a little ahead of the curve kind of in my role and with my background, but I think that's the shift that we're going to see over time for most organizations. Right, and so as we, again, start to think about what is the right tool to use at the right time. Okay, so if I'm just exploring, if I'm ideating on something, and so for me, that was brainstorming over how I wanted to go through and structure the content for the presentation today, that's Copilot, that's normal ChatGPT, that's normal Claude, that's normal Google Gemini, right? We want to go through and kind of use our per user per month unlimited usage as part of that tool to go through and do our ideation. Right, when we then want to go through and optimize in a particular area, that's when I'm looking to do first-party agents. This could be Copilot CodeWork, this could be Claude CodeWork, but that's where I can, again, kind of have those, I'm going to go take actions and go through and kind of get things done. Over time, we want to drive real business process automation, and these are going to be where we're building those agents that I talked about that we're going to go through and do some level of custom development. And then in some cases here, right, we're even starting to see what I call autopilots. And these are going to be always-on agents that work autonomously in the background, right? With again, human oversight and human direction, but are able to go through and get things done without humans having to go through and intervene 100% of the time. All right, and so when we think about agents, again, this is where I'm really seeing the business value come from agent deployment. At scale here, right? You can think of them in three ways. I've got a retrieval agent, which lets me go through and essentially kind of retrieve information. So an example of this might be, we had a customer that is doing, they create an ERP system and they sell that software, and they do a lot of customer support as part of that. They have a huge knowledge base of articles. And so they wanted to go through and create kind of a self-service tool that allows, first internally their customer service to ask a question to get an answer, and then eventually release this to their customers. And so in that scenario here, we have a retrieval agent that is grounded on their specific data. So it's pointed at their set of knowledge-based articles that we can then go through and reason, summarize, and answer user questions on that. A more complex agent is a task-based agent. right? So this is where we're going to go through and automate workflows. And so an example for this might be, where we go through and have an email come in with an invoice that we're expected to pay. Previously, that might be a human being that would have to process that email. They'd have to look at the invoice that come in. They might have to match it back to a purchase order. They've got to create a record in their business system and then ultimately issue a check to get that done. A task agent can go through, monitor the inbox, when that comes in, extract the necessary information from the attached document, route it to an approver kind of within the business, and then ultimately go through and add that record directly to the business system. So in that case, we've kind of automated what used to be a human workflow within what I would call an agentic workflow, where we have kind of a combination of some business process automation and then using AI when needed to kind of make decisions as part of that. And then again, the kind of the most advanced are going to be autonomous agents. And these are going to be ones that dynamically plan, that have agents that coordinate and orchestrate other agents. And an example on this one might be like an RFP response agent where I go through and have agents that solve different parts of that tasks. One that goes through and creates the document structure for the response. One that goes through and pulls data that exists from our organization and help uses that to fill it in. One that is there to go through and do essentially the project management of that whole task. So make sure that humans that have to get their job done go through and do so on time. Right, and then one agent to go through and kind of manage that all. So we can get pretty complex in terms of the scenarios that we're looking to do. And so the important thing here is to kind of understand, when we go through and talk about use cases coming up, right, how to go through and kind of pick the right agent for the job and how to go through and kind of do so in an iterative way where we're kind of picking high value use cases, that corresponds to kind of the level of effort to get this done. All right. So I'll pause for a minute here and kind of shift gears a little bit. So we've talked a lot about just kind of the technology, right? What is an AI assistant? What is a large language model? How do these enterprise AI systems go through and work? And now I want to talk more about how do we actually drive the business outcome that we want. This is the kind of the practical side of what does implementation look like for your business. And so we see kind of this AI maturity journey that businesses go across. So to start, we've really got to go through and define what is our AI strategy. And so this can mean a lot of things to a lot of different organizations. And a lot of this is going to be dependent on, again, where you're at. I expect this to evolve as you go down kind of this maturity here, right? But we want to go through, figure out what our tools are. We want to go through and kind of figure out what is our technical readiness, what are the things that we have to do from a prerequisite standpoint to go through and kind of get ready to go through and drive AI adoption. So if we look at the top here, again, for a lot of organizations, the first step is I'm going to shut it all down until I get a handle on what's going on. Now, I will tell you that I've not seen that be very successful. That I would only recommend that as a very temporary activity. But right now, you've got people in your organizations that are using AI today, whether it's sanctioned or not. We see a lot of personal AI tools brought to work. And again, if we're not giving them a set of tools, they're going to probably try to find a way to get around it. Now, this isn't everybody. What we kind of see here is that if you look at most organizations, about 10% are going to be super gung-ho. They're playing with the tools in their personal life. They're innovating and trying to figure out ways to go through and help the business with that. You got about 60% that if you give them a tool and tell them to use it and give them some support, they're going to get real value out of it. And the remaining kind of 25 to 30%, they're going to actively fight you. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to go through and deal with them coming up. Right. But again, no AI is kind of the starting point. And then from there, we kind of see, we may try out a few tools. We may have, give people some licenses if they request them as part of that. But where we really want to start to get to from a maturity standpoint is we want to pick a standardized set of tools. We want to have paid accounts. We want to make sure we have enterprise data protection and that our data is protected. Right from there, okay, and again, that could be Copilot Chat in the Microsoft world. This could just be basic licenses with ChatGPT, Claude, and Google. But what we really want to get to is where we have the tools connected to our data sources. And so this could be SharePoint, this could be Teams, it could be Slack, it could be Zoom, it could be Google Workspace, right? It could be our line of business systems. But the more that we can go through and get our tools connected to where our data lives, the more value the AI tools are going to be able to go through and get us. And then we want to start looking at things like first-party agent usage, right? So that could be co-work. It could also be agents like the PowerPoint agent that I use to go through and kind of build this deck today, right? There's a lot of value that comes from those where we're looking at, again, agents that are essentially kind of optimized AIs for specific tasks we're trying to accomplish. And then from there, we want to go through and start iterating over custom agent development, right? And so that's where we start to go through and look at where we can reimagine business processes to go through and have AI make them better, more efficient, more effective. Now, while all of this is going on, we need to be looking at technical readiness in parallel. A lot of what we do and help customers with is we want to figure out what's the minimum that we do. We want to go through and get value out of AI sooner rather than later, but we won't want to go through and forget that we need to go through and get our security and data governance house in order. So again, as we kind of look at the maturity, we see data in a lot of different places, a lot of different systems. Maybe I have some in the cloud, some I have in on-premise environments, right? But we generally see we have siloed data. The better scenario is we want to try to consolidate data in the cloud, because that's where all of the AI tools have access to your data. They're not typically going through and connecting to on-premise data sources. They want to go through and be able to connect to other cloud services. From there, we want to start looking at permissions to the data, who has access to what is my oversharing risk kind of in those scenarios. But where we really need to get to is data governance. And so a good example of this is it's thinking of the kind of that third box there as who has permission, kind of the security risk. Okay, the data governance risk is what is the quality of data that we're pointing AI at. And so think about technology for a minute. I've got, you look in my environment, I've got data from all of the different Microsoft products that have been released going back to 2012 sitting in my environment. And so if I ask a question about one of those products, okay, I don't want it reasoning across the document that was created in 2013. So part of getting your data house in order is making sure that I'm getting rid of stale data, okay, that I'm organizing it in a way that gives the AI better access to it and making sure that it's using the right documents at the right time, okay, to go through and produce the right business outcome. And then as we see kind of the explosion of agent adoption across businesses, monitoring agent usage, being able to govern those, being able to secure those. In a lot of cases, sometimes even giving them their own identities with their own set of permissions is going to be really important to go through and kind of drive success in that space. Right, but it's okay to be in different spots on here. The idea is that we want to be able to increment on this over time, okay, and try to get towards the right where we can really drive the business transformation that we're all looking for. So if we look at accelerating AI transformation here, right? So we're in an interesting place. I will tell you right now that it's the limiting factor is not the model capabilities right now. It is not the model harnesses, right? Fundamentally right now, okay, the limitation in terms of driving AI adoption across business is that we've got to go through and get humans to change their behavior. We've got to understand our business processes and figure out how to optimize it. So when we start looking at how to go through and drive adoption, we kind of think of it two ways. So first, we want to look at this by user persona. Depending on what role you have in the business, like how you go through and benefit from AI can vary quite a bit depending on that role, right? So we want to go through and as we roll things out, we want to go through and help support users by giving them targeted use cases that align specifically with their user needs. We want to go through and look at kind of taking change management strategies where we go through and make sure that we're driving skilling and adoption. Because again, go back to that kind of 10, 60, 30 I mentioned before. 10% aren't going to need that support. They're going to off and run. 60% are going to go through and they need the support to go through and be successful. The last thing we want to do is give them a tool. They go try it once. They don't get a good answer because they don't know how to use it. And then they go back to doing what they were doing the whole time. Right, and then that's the worst case scenario. I'm not paying for a tool, and I'm not actually getting any ROI back on that one. And then as we start thinking about agents and things like that, we want to go through and think of it from a business process standpoint. Where do we have places that are inefficiencies? Where can we drive AI opportunities? And so, we've seen a lot of success here in trying to drive like contests to go through and submit use cases that could have impact to the business. And so figuring out how to map those, how to go through and drive the redesign that leverages AI, and then ultimately make sure that we're measuring the impact, right? What is the time saving every time an agent runs versus something that a human would have done, right? So not just going through and driving towards some of this transformation, but being able to go through and track the output on the other side. And so if we can focus on persona and focus on business process, what we really see on the other side of that is that we get faster adoption. We get kind of that scalable integration here, right, where we're kind of applying this across multiple departments. And then we really need kind of that executive buy-in at the high end, right? We've got to be able to go through and show them clear ROI and business value as part of the process. And with all of this, how we go through and pitch it to our employees matters quite a bit. If we go in and say, hey, we want to implement AI because we want to go through and cut 25% of our customer service jobs and save money, that's a really bad way to go talk about it. You're going to go through and take that 30%, and they're going to say, I told you so. They're coming for my job. We want to get rid of it. Instead, what we want to go through and say, hey, we want to go through and use that to help us grow our business faster, to be more profitable. Okay, we're not looking to cut jobs, but we want to be able to scale with the people that we have. Right? We want to be able to go through and add new jobs in other areas that we would otherwise. That's the message that ultimately works. And if we can do that, we want to go through and get the business on our side, our users on our side, at driving better outcomes versus fighting us in those scenarios. So with that, when we talk about kind of that user adoption here, figuring out who our change champions are, who are those 10% that are already doing some of this stuff anyway, we want to get them engaged, but we also want to pick some of those resistors, right? If we can get them to be part of the change champion standpoint, we kind of co-opt their and learn about their kind of their worst case scenarios, and that helps go through and essentially kind of defuse, right, by making them part of the process, which is pretty valuable. We want to make sure we're prioritizing the things that are going to have the highest business outcome, right? So the things that we're doing that are the most manual, we want to make sure that we're looking at what are our measurements to gauge success. We want to build a communications plan. We don't just toss the tool out there and say, here you go, guys, go use it, right? We want to go through and support them. We want to let them know it's there. We want to give them an understanding of how to use it. We want to continue to reinforce over time, and we want to provide training. Right, we want to make sure that they know how to use the tools, provide on-demand resources for them, and again, there's tons and tons of data that's out there, and frankly, one of the things that we do a lot of times in our customer engagements is to teach them how to use AI to help use AI better, which is actually a great way to go through and leverage those tools as well. All right, so as we think about transformation, where should you start? And so this is a busy slide. I'm not going to talk about all of this stuff. Right, but fundamentally here, you have kind of a list. These are all things that are reasonably manual processes that require a lot of human intervention, okay, that are use cases that can go through and benefit from AI and agentic workflows. And so this is just a starting point, right? But again, as you're thinking about your business, all of these scenarios are things we should be thinking about. Where is the friction in my business? Where is the manual process that we can look to go through and drive transformation with? And as we then go through and start to figure out what are our priority use cases, that's where we start the business process discovery. So we want to understand where are we going? What is our future state goal that we're trying to accomplish, right? And again, we don't want to go through and be constrained by the current state, right? We want to go through and figure out if this was a perfect world, how would I go and re-engineer this process? Now to do that, we still have to understand the current state. And I will tell you, a lot of businesses don't do a good job of understanding their own business processes. A lot of times we'll go in and we'll have conversations and we'll find out that, hey, it's supposed to work like this. It's supposed to be step A, then B, then C, then D. And it's actually A, then D, then B, and sometimes C, but not always, where they actually do E and F. Right. So we've got to go through and make sure that we understand what it is, because we can't change it without understanding the current point. Then we go through and we ideate. And a lot of times here we're going through and we're using AI tools like Copilot, like Claude. We're asking them to help us go through and do that brainstorming, right? Let's figure out how we go through and make this better. And then from there, that's where we build the plan, whether it's building an agent, whether it's building a workflow with an agent. In some cases, we go through and we do these focus groups with customers, and they're like, hey, well, can AI do this? And what they're asking for isn't for AI. They just want a workflow. Right. So a lot of times just having these conversations around how do we drive improvement can lead to, again, back to what is the right tool for the job. Let's not go through and try to use AI if AI is not the right answer to my business problem. Right. And so again, kind of coming back to that concept of what to use when, what is the right tool for the job. We're seeing kind of the basic, kind of the general purpose tools, whether it's Copilot, whether it's Claude, whether it's ChatGPT or Gemini, right? That becomes our ideation tool. That's where we go through and draft content. Basically we're using it in a very unstructured way, right? We're solving novel problems without having a predefined workflow. And then tools like co-work or custom built agents are when we understand on what the outcome is, right? And we want to be able to go through and drive kind of that repeatability over time and free up human capacity for higher value work, where again, they're the ones directing the AI agents to drive the outcomes that we want. So if we do all of this stuff, right, where does the ROI come from our business? So with AI assistance, okay, faster task completion, right? So the output of work should be higher if you're using AI effectively. But don't underestimate, okay, that you're getting, in almost all cases, better accuracy and quality. I will tell you, I put out a much, much better and more polished set of presentations now than I ever did before. And it's, while I may have all kinds of technical knowledge in my head, my ability to create engaging PowerPoints was pretty much zero, right? So again, if you liked the look and feel of this even a little bit, I guarantee you this was a million times better than anything I would have produced on my own today as part of that. AI agents, right? This is where we're driving kind of that task replacement, where we're like going through and connecting to our business systems and things like that. But more and more, I'm seeing agentic workflows as the kind of the concept here that really unlocks the business outcome, right? And so what this means is that we want to go through and understand what is our business process end to end, what does our workflow look like, and then in some cases, we want to go through and use a workflow tool to go through and accomplish this, right? And anytime we can do something that is deterministic. And what I mean by that is it's the same way every time. We have an algorithm that can go through and drive. We want to use workflow tools. We want to write code to get that done, right? We want to leverage AI, okay, when needed. And so basically anytime where there's a human level of judgment, okay, we can use AI to go through and help, whether it's making a decision around the next step, whether it's extracting information, whether it's summarizing. Okay, all of those things are about using AI at the right time within a particular process, right? And then ultimately, with an agentic workflow, we are able to combine automation, human review, okay, so it's called human in the loop, and AI reasoning at the right time. So the keys here, if you go through and kind of think about like what do I have to make sure I do? So first, we're changing human workflows. We're not just putting tools in front of them. We've got to go through and change that. And one of the really interesting things here is, well, what happens if I suddenly become 25% more productive, right? Do I just do 25% less work, and then it kind of makes up for that? Maybe my 40-hour week becomes a 30-hour week. Well, okay, that might be nice from an end user standpoint, but that's not great from a business outcome standpoint, right? If we're going to go through and invest in these tools, we've got to see ROI come out of them, and so we want to have a plan to go through and repurpose that time that's freed up by the assistant usage. So again, I think for most executives, right, you have more on your plate than you know what to do, right? If you got free time, that just means you're going to move to other tasks and go through and do that, right? But again, there might be some people on our team we've got to go through and monitor to make sure that they're able to take advantage of that. And then we want to make sure that we're starting especially our agentic automation with high value repeatable processes. Let's go and start with what I would call the low hanging fruit of ROI, and let's maybe not go through and try to pick the most complicated process to go through and get done. And ultimately with that, we want to measure kind of the productivity, the quality, the cost, the risk, the business impact. And again, only use AI when you need to, right? Especially as we go through and get away from kind of that AI assistant, which is typically per user per month. When we're building agents, we're usually paying consumption charges to the AI providers to go through and leverage that. So again, making sure that we're understanding what is the value of what we're doing, what does it cost every time the agent runs. Okay, that's how we go through and make sure that we're investing in the right things at the right time. So I want to share a few examples where we've gone through and built some things for customers. And so the first actually isn't AI, it's just a business process automation. So this was leveraging kind of the Microsoft 365 platform. It's a manufacturing firm. They have to go through and report to OSHA and things like that on their safety and compliance on their manufacturing floor. So very common kind of that. And their existing process was built on paper inspection forms. And so we helped build an application for them on Power Apps. So this was part of their Microsoft 365 licensing that they could use either in the browser or on an iPad, and basically kind of replicated their existing set of forms. And so now, instead of collecting the data on paper, I'm collecting it on a form that can store it in a database. Right. Well, if it's in a database, that's fantastic, because now it means I can go through and build very easy reports that are shareable with internal stakeholders and to the regulatory bodies. I don't have to go through and sort through a bunch of paper to go through and figure out where I have exceptions. And so that also means that if the person didn't complete the inspections on time, we can have automations to drive escalations. And again, when we had failed inspection items, again, automation to go through and alert leadership when we had that process. And so, in the end, the outcome for that business was much less time to go through and produce the reports, but the main value to them was improving their compliance, because now they can ensure their inspections are missed, and that anytime they had a failed inspection, that they were able to go through and have a follow-up action item to go through and remediate it as well. All right, so the next one is interesting here in that it's more of a traditional AI use case. And so the organization here is a road construction firm, and they do a lot of bidding on public contracts to go through and build roads, reconstruct roads, things like that. And so they were winning a lot of the stuff, but they suspected here that they were essentially pricing themselves too low, right? It was, again, in the end, these projects go to the lowest bidder. So you want to be the lowest, but you don't want to be too low, right? Because if you're too low, then that margin, you're essentially leaving margin on the table when winning the bid. So what we did was we built an automation with them to go through and pull info from the state websites that publish the bidding data. And so these documents are pretty big, and the data structure is not the same from document to document here. So that's a great place to go through and use AI to extract information from these semi-structured documents. We put that in a database where we then build a machine learning model that would predict their competitors' bids. Right. And so as a result here, when they went then to go through and make a new bid, they could put in, here's all the things that we need to do. They would have a machine learning model that would predict their competitors' bids, and then they could go through and ultimately adjust their bid appropriately. And so the outcome there, 3 to 4 points additional margin. And when you're talking $1 million contracts, plus, right, that's $30,000 to $40,000 on a $1 million project. That's $300,000 on a $10 million projects. So that's real money, okay, that came just from making their bidding process more efficient. So we'll go back to a different manufacturing firm here, and this is a scenario around generative AI. And I love this one because this is really common across a lot of organizations. So it could be manufacturing, but it really could be any firm here that has human resources. And so the goal here was to go through and drive a better employee experience for their end users, but then also to reduce HR time spent answering HR policy, benefits questions, and things like that. And so we're able to go through and integrate an agent for HR self-service that was built, essentially kind of 80% built by Microsoft, right? So we had to go through and kind of wire this up to connect to their HR application to look up individual benefits info. We were able to connect it to a document repository where they stored all of their policies and procedures. And so essentially this allowed users in a chat in Microsoft Teams to go through and do a significant level of HR self-service, right? They could ask questions, but then if they had something like, well, okay, I'm complaining about my manager, well, that's something you probably need to talk to a human too. So it could also go through and escalate to the HR team when necessary as well. And so in the scenario here, we didn't really have a way to go through and kind of measure the improvement in the employee experience, although the feedback that we got from them was pretty good. But in the end, it reduced the request to HR and the time spent on it by 70%. So we definitely saw like a big impact there, where HR could go through and focus on bigger picture issues versus spending a lot of time answering questions that probably could have been looked up by the user if they just knew where to go through and look. So great outcome in that particular business. So we're about ready to take questions, but I've just got a few takeaways here, to go through and kind of summarize what we talked about. Right. So in the end, we don't want to lead with technology. We always want to start with a business problem. So we want to think about what are the outcomes we want, what are the pain points we have, the opportunities for improvement. Second, okay, I think you've got to build the AI habits, right? We don't want to jump straight into agents. We want to start with assistants. We want to get people using the tools on an everyday basis. We want to help people understand what is the possibility space for AI, and then start to take the steps toward building and implementing agents across your business. Governance obviously is important. We've got to protect our data. We've got to define the controls. We've got to make sure that we're using the approved tools effectively. Apologies, my headset's being weird. So back on here. All right, so we want to measure outcomes and not usage. I've seen organizations that have gone through and measured kind of AI usage, right? So it could be things like token consumption. And so what that incentivized was a lot of very inefficient AI usage, right? In the end, the outcome that matters, okay, is ultimately the productivity improvement. So focus on the outcome, not the actual usage of the tools. And then fifth, go through and start small and then scale what works. Let's pick that high value use case. Let's measure the results, improve the process, and expand from there. And ultimately more and more, like I said before, we're seeing success determined less by model and more by the approach that you take to go through and drive adoption. All right, so let's talk. Let's go through and kind of look at your specific use cases, your specific questions. But I've got a few things to go through and kind of maybe jumpstart some of the conversation. Where do you go through and see, could AI help your team work faster, better, more consistently? Right? What are the repetitive processes that you're struggling with, right, that we can go through and improve? Right? What are your concerns about data or governance or adoption that we can go through and chat through?
Okay, Mike, we have a question here. Someone asks, as a business owner, should I be concerned with the weight of memory and storage with MS Copilot or any AI on my server or phone or computer capacity?
I think in most cases, the answer is going to be no, right? So when we talk about Copilot or a lot of these other tools, when we're paying for kind of the per user per month, we have a level of consumption that kind of comes with that. And most of the time when you go through and kind of get to the enterprise plans, those are going to be kind of all you can eat kind of in those scenarios. Now there's some nuance to that. Some of the Claude plans will go through and have limitations on some of the higher end model usage, right? Where they'll go through and say you're going to get a certain amount kind of per month and then it resets. So there is some nuance to that, but fundamentally, for the most part, as we go through and generate a lot of this AI usage, kind of the memory, all of them are going to go through and essentially kind of have, for the most part, unlimited memory and storage that kind of goes with that. And so, for your servers, your phones, or your computer capacity, I mean, all of it's really executing in the background of the cloud, right? So it's not something where you are directly constrained when we're using kind of the public AI tools, kind of in those scenarios.
Okay. I have a question for you. I was struggling to understand. You were talking about the difference between having, like in the beginning, having employees become comfortable with the assistants, right? And then moving from there to agents, right? And I'm trying to understand can employees develop, quotes, their own personal system? Because you gave examples where your organization was helping the company at a higher level develop a system, right, for the organization. But can an individual employee develop their own, quote, system?
No, so the answer is yes in a lot of cases, but it's going to vary quite a bit from provider to provider, kind of depending on what you're doing. So I'm going to go through and switch my screen share here because I want to actually take it into what this looks like on my side in Copilot here. So bear with me just a minute. Go through and bring that up. Okay, so this is inside of my production environment on Microsoft 365. This is where we kind of operate as part of that. But I think it gives kind of a good example. You'll see a lot of the just my history over here on the left side, kind of my chats as part of that. You'll see this is where I was talking about iterating on the presentation as I was working on kind of preparing it today and pulling content from the different things that we have here. But we've got a couple places that we can go through and kind of do some of this stuff. So most of them are going to have the ability to go through and create this concept of an agent, or in the Microsoft world, we're going to call this kind of a Copilot Lite agent. And so when I come in here, I go to this, and almost all of them have the ability, I can go describe in natural language what it is I want to go through and accomplish as part of that. And so I have the ability as an end user to go through and create an agent. So in this case, what I'm doing is essentially I'm giving a custom set of instructions that are going to be there every time this agent runs. Okay, when I kind of run through this interface as part of that. So let's kind of skip that just to go through and see kind of what it looks like. Here's where I would go through and kind of enter in what are my custom instructions as part of this. What knowledge do I want it to go through and use? So can I give it the ability to search websites? Do I want to go through and connect to certain parts of my data in my internal environment? What capabilities do I want to go through and give it? And then what suggested prompts? And so all of them have some level of capability like this to go through and create. Within the Microsoft ecosystem, I can go through and do this, but then I can also create an agent and share it with other people.
Wow.
Right, and I'm able to do so kind of within that Microsoft 365 ecosystem. Now, the place where we start to get into like what this looks like building at a deeper level, right, and starting to connect to our line of business systems and getting beyond just kind of Microsoft 365 is when we get into Copilot Studio. And this is where I can go through and create custom agents and interact with them, that can connect to my business systems. And I'll give you kind of a silly one that I went through and spun up a couple months ago. But the use case here was we implemented new tax software for our business based on the number of geographies that we work in. And when you work in IT services, certain types of services, I mean, it varies based on state, obviously, but some states, if you're just doing like pure consulting or advisory, it's not taxable, right? But if I'm working with like physical infrastructure, it is taxable. And so my accounting team said, I don't know how to go through and figure that out. So I created an agent that they can interact with inside of Microsoft Teams. And basically, all we're doing here is we're able to go through and give it the name of a project and have it come back with two possible classifications, right? And so what I'm driving here is just repeatability. And so they can go through, they ask the question, they get a classification. And so step one, okay, was to go through and give them this self-help tool that they can go ask the question and get an answer back. What we're working on right now is to go through and integrate this from an end-to-end workflow. We do create a statement of work for a customer. They sign it, it comes back in. We've got to extract information from that SAL. We've got to understand what it is we're trying to accomplish, right? We've got to go through and figure out what was the cost of it, what's the budget, who's going to be doing it. We've got to pull all of that information out. We've got to put it into our line of business systems. And so this becomes one agent that becomes part of a broader workflow. So extract that information, and then this becomes one switch that gets flipped. And when we set it up in the business system, well, what's the tax status? Okay, great. I have an agent that can do that, but this becomes one step as part of a broader business, a broader business workflow that we're ultimately kind of implementing internally.
Wow. I also was wondering with you were talking about how you can use natural language, right? Natural human language. As a consultant, are you also operating at that level? Are you basically using natural human language to create these systems for?
At least as a starting point, right? Yeah. So like when I went through and created that one as an example here, it was a very simple one. So I basically described it in natural language, what I was trying to accomplish, and it produced it on the other side. So I literally spun that up in that agent in 15 minutes and assigned it to the end users and kind of published it to them and gave them a little bit of an understanding of what's there. That they could go through and use it. So for simple ones, you can go through and do that very quickly and easily. For more complex stuff, it's nice to go through and have it take a first pass, but then you would expect that there's going to be some more configuration, particularly if I want to connect it to like a line of business system, right? It's one thing if I'm working with data entirely within like Google Workspace or within Microsoft 365, but if I want to connect to an ERP system, for example, and be able to query that data, right? Typically that's going to require a level of configuration that would still have human involved in helping with that.
Wow. And with at that lowest level with the assistants, so I think you established at the beginning that all of the Microsoft Office applications have the built-in assistant, correct? Is that correct?
Yep. So what I'm working in, again, within the Copilot ecosystem, right, I've got more specific, essentially kind of within Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, and Teams. So I've got Copilot available as part of that. And so with ChatGPT, I'm generally working kind of within their primary interface and setting up a connection to Microsoft 365. So I can still access my data, but I'm using ChatGPT with Microsoft data. I'm generally still working in ChatGPT. Claude, kind of the same model, right? Again, I can use kind of within the Claude interface, but at the same time, I can then go through with Claude. I know they have plugins, right? So I can have a plugin for Outlook. I can have a plugin for Word, a plugin for Excel that lets me use it directly inside of those tools as well.
Wow.
Right. And all that stuff's kind of a moving target. I mean, that's Claude didn't have that until like a month ago. So again, all of these things, understand if you're watching this now or you're watching this later, everything we're talking about is a point in time as of July 21st, 2026.
But I wanted to ask you is, so at that first level where you're saying organizations have to encourage people to use these tools as assistants to start to get familiar with it, is it literally like someone's working in PowerPoint and they use an assistant to solve a problem in PowerPoint or with their presentation or something?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that was a big part of how I went through and built the presentation today. I spent, if you go back here, and I'll take you into the kind of the chat interface here. So let me expand that out. Or I'll show you my I'll just do a quick scroll here to go through and show, right? But you'll see here, I mean, this is a pretty long chat. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of iteration, a lot of ideas. And I was using kind of this Copilot chat, so very, very long, to then go through and turn into, when I got inside of PowerPoint, using Copilot inside of PowerPoint, which is very kind of fit for purpose in terms of like understanding how to create a slide deck and how to go through and do that. But a lot of times I would use Copilot to create the instructions to then give the agent inside of PowerPoint what I actually wanted to go through and accomplish.
Oh, well.
Right. And so that's where I kind of spent most of my day kind of I mean, not all of it, but I mean, a decent part of the day going through and kind of managing that process. Okay. Going back and forth between the two tools to go through and produce what in the end I thought was a very polished, set of content.
Yeah.
Copilot agrees with the grading.
So, but I'm wondering, in terms of like from an executive standpoint, to try to get people into this, right, their employees into this as individuals, is there a big obstacle to individual employees using assistants within Office applications?
The place where I see friction on that one is just not knowing how to use it to go through and kind of get the right outcome. And so the usage pattern that I just described, do my ideation inside of Copilot, then go to the PowerPoint specific agent in PowerPoint to actually create the content and work on the content, isn't something that comes naturally to people. Right. So if they go in and they're starting to try to do the ideation in PowerPoint, they're probably not going to get a very good answer right back as part of that. Right. They're going to go through, it's going to try to do too much. It's going to go through and spin a bunch of cycles creating content for you. You're not going to like it. You're going to get frustrated and go back to doing it yourself. Right. So the issue is that we don't want to just toss these tools out there and say, go use them. There's usage patterns that produce good outcomes. And if we can coach them on how to go through and use them effectively, we want to make sure that the first few times they use the tools, they get a positive result and they feel like it benefits them in that scenario. Because if we send them to the tools, they don't get a good output. They end up going through and coming back and going back to what they were doing the whole time. And I'll show you here, Microsoft's kind of updated the interface here a little bit, but if I want to go back to their old design, but one of the things that was a common problem here, like kind of the early Copilot adoption was, if you look up here, we have this work and web. Okay, work is leveraging kind of that grounding in my content in my organization. Okay, web means I'm only going through and using content from the web. And so a lot of times, like before Microsoft kind of updated their interface here, if users went through and asked a general purpose research question and I had work selected, I would get a materially worse answer because it was trying to overground on my internal content versus going out and doing the external research. Oh, right. And so again, they've improved that, right? And this is something where the tools, the harnesses are getting better to go through and prevent those scenarios. But I had a lot of organizations go through and say, man, I hate Copilot because I don't get good answers. And they would compare it to ChatGPT, and I'm like, but it's the same underlying model, right? They're still, it's the exact same model on either side. The difference was if you had the work toggle versus the web, you got a significantly worse answer. Again, not the case anymore in the new interface, but that's where, again, you toss it out there, you don't give them the right tools, they get a bad outcome, you're not seeing the results that you want.
Let's see. Jerry, I don't know if you're listening. I was wondering if you might have any additional questions.
Yeah. Well, I don't. Not necessarily a question, but just the practical applications of AI versus with a small business versus a larger business, with like kind of enterprise level when you've got 100 plus employees versus a smaller company with 10, 20, 30 employees. From my experience is that the application of AI becomes extremely different at those levels and what kind of focus and outcomes you should take. Do you have any suggestions for like small business owners and how they should think about using AI versus a larger business?
No, I think that's actually a really good point, right? So a lot of the stuff where we talked about like agent development being something that is, I think the big focus for where you're going to see ROI, I think that model shifts when we start talking about smaller businesses, right? For smaller businesses, they're obviously lower employee count, right, is really going to be focused on maximizing the productivity of that individual headcount. So AI as assistant, AI to help me solve the specific things that I'm doing, okay, is really where I would go through and focus in that case. So a lot of the things that we talked about there around building agents were around like business process automation, but for small business, I think the focus is more on individual personal productivity. And so that's figuring out what are my personal workflows that I'm doing? How do I really optimize my usage of the AI tools? How do I leverage kind of first party agents when appropriate? And again, if we look at kind of in this Microsoft world, we've got a set of kind of agents that are built in, right, that Microsoft has gone through and created. Research, I will tell you, is one that's amazing. So if you're, I don't do this if you're a college student, but researchers are a great way to go kind of take a topic and basically build a research paper on it, which is pretty amazing. But it'll do deep research. It may take 10, 15 minutes to go through and come back with an answer, but it's a great way to go through and kind of skill up on something. Analyst is a great one for actually doing data analysis across Excel and things like that. So if you're, again, think of small business owner, I might have 10, 15 people, right? I want to go through and do analysis of my P&L, right? And kind of understand, hey, am I hitting the profit targets that I should? What are the improvements I should make for my business? Leveraging an agent like Analyst, okay, is incredibly valuable in that scenario. Right. So I think it's, again, just making sure that we understand what are the tools that are available to us and really focusing on personal productivity versus like kind of that business process automation we were talking about otherwise.
Wow. All right. I don't see any other.
I don't really, I don't have another question necessarily, but just a reiteration, I think, on one of the points that you made earlier during your presentation, that is really important for business owners in general is the laying out of your business processes and workflows before you go and start talking with a consulting firm or whatever about your AI. It's gonna save you so much money to do the research and understand your business and step by step how things happen and map that out before you talk to implementing the AI.
Yeah. I mean that's 100% spot on. The more you understand your own business process, the better off you're going to be before you either interact with a consultant or interact with the AI tools or try to go build something on your own. A lot of the stuff, I mean, it's getting to the point where as kind of a power user, I don't have to be super technical to go through and build some of this stuff. But one of the common failure modes I see for organizations is I'm going to go through and try to have an agent do a giant task, right? Or a giant process end to end as part of that. And so they essentially try to bite off more than they can chew, right? And ultimately go through and fail, or they spin a bunch of tokens and it ends up being really expensive, right? So being able to go through and kind of scope out, well, here's what I want to do. Right, here's what my process looks like today. Here are the places where I can leverage AI to drive an outcome, okay, is really the way to go through and approach it, right? AI is not the solution for everything. It's just a really, really valuable tool at certain points, certain high leverage points as we go through and get tasks done.
Oh. All right, well, our time's just about up. I don't see any other questions, so... Do you have any final comments, Mike?
No, this is a rapidly changing world. It's a rapidly changing field. It's going to continue to go through and drive a lot of innovation. We're seeing a lot of talk now around kind of regulation. We had a new model that was dropped on Friday from a Chinese company called Kimi. And it is open source, which is kind of interesting, right? So if we look at things like from Claude and from OpenAI, those are what we would call closed source models. They're owned by those companies. They're not releasing the model weights that are part of that. With the Kimi model, it's one you can actually go through and run your own. Like they publish the model weights, so essentially it's something you can run it on your own hardware pretty quickly and easily. And what's interesting about it is previously, Claude, I think, has generally had what most people would consider to be the most frontier models, the most capable models as part of that. Kimi scored basically at 95% on all of the benchmarks at like 1/10 the cost, right? So again, I think what's important over time here is that the cost of intelligence is going down. Okay, the capabilities of the intelligence are starting to converge, right, on very similar capabilities. And in the end, what's going to matter is, can I harness those AIs effectively? Can I connect it to my data? That's the differentiator, not the actual model capabilities themselves. Try to use that as kind of a final takeaway for everyone.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was really great and really fascinating. So
All right. Well, appreciate the chance to be with everybody as always. I know this is the last class for the summer so far. We look forward to seeing everybody back in September as we pick back up.
All right. Well, thanks so much. So we got a final comment here. Thank you, Mike. Very instructive. So.
Hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care.
All right. Thank you.